This episode is brought to you by Redfin. You're listening to a podcast, which means you're probably multitasking. Maybe even scrolling home listings on Redfin, saving homes without expecting to get them. But Redfin isn't just built for endless browsing. It's built to help you find and own a home. With agents who close twice as many deals, when you find the one, you've got a real shot at getting it. Get started at redfin.com. Own the dream.
Hey, it's Sterling K. Brown from the Hulu original series Paradise. The next chapter begins as Xavier's search for his wife takes him above ground, and what he finds will change everything. It was never just about the bunker. Tune in and discover the truth lies outside. Paradise, the official podcast, is now streaming, and stream Paradise on Hulu and Hulu on Disney+.
Welcome back to Marvelous Disney, the podcast where Dan Graney and I talk about Marvel, Disney, theme parks, movies, and the moments where the company quietly tells you who they think they are now. I'm entertainment writer Jim Hill, and I'm joined, as always, by that dynamic Dan Graney, and who's just back from a kind of cold golf game. Is that correct?
Nick, my son turns 12, or 12. He turns 14 tomorrow, and we went to Topgolf this afternoon, and it was quite chilly. Quite chilly and windy. And I'd like to say that my performance, that affected my performance. But honestly, the wind probably only helped.
Okay, well, just to be clear here, folks, we are recording this week's episode on Sunday, March 1st, 2026. So we've officially flipped the calendar. Spring is theoretically around the corner. And somewhere in America, Doctor Doom Oreos are now being placed strategically on end caps. And by the way, Dan, a little anecdote here. I learned from Lauren Hersey, my co-host on I Want That Too, our Disney merch podcast, that I have been using my, the Stuff of Legends Oreos wrong. Did you know you're supposed to lick these things?
Is that where the color changing technology comes
there we
into
go.
play?
I mean, I was a moron. I literally would take the Oreo, unscrew it, and look and go, gray. Okay, yeah, that in the food technology lab, that's what you want. Gray food. Mm-hmm. But no, it turns out if you lick it, then they turn blue. There's something in our saliva that then turns whatever this thing is into bright blue. So so I now I have to go get more Oreos because I did it wrong.
Yeah. Okay. Well, one thing I am kind of excited about is that my Doctor Doom Oreos are in the mail.
Of course they are.
And I should, on top of that, Jim, I want to say I somehow got on the Oreo wait list for the Doctor Doom Oreos.
There's a wait list?
There was a wait list. It put a reminder on my calendar, which I share with my wife, and my wife was at her work, and she goes, only my husband would have a calendar event that says pre-order Doctor Doom Oreos. I have no problem with this.
Oh, all right. You work the pop culture side of the street. This is important.
Absolutely.
So, but anyway, so what else, other than, waiting for this very urgent package, as we look out ahead to the first week of March, what are we thinking?
Well, let me tell you, like I mentioned, I whereas I should have been maybe hydrating or stretching or preparing for the terrible golf game that I mentioned, I did find myself staring at executive interviews and IMAX contracts instead, because, this week, it didn't feel, I would say, in the world of Marvel but also in the world of film and studios, not counting some substantial deal that just happened. This week didn't feel loud so much as it felt strategic. And I would just like to say, it was almost like a lot of pieces were quietly moving across a board.
And you're not wrong there. I get both in, the rather big news, the whole, Netflix dropping out and Paramount, now getting Warner Brothers, which doesn't seem to make the folks at Warner Brothers all that happy. But meanwhile, in another studio complex in Burbank, you're not wrong. The conceit of a chessboard or board members. Now, mind you, there were no trailer drops this week. There was no shocking casting news. But as you mentioned, looking at those executive interviews and looking at those IMAX contracts, you track the release calendar, you track the licensing. Pieces are shifting, and we're going to talk about that on this week's show. But before we do that, we have to acknowledge our sponsor, which is, of course, unlockmagic.com, where you get real discounts on Walt Disney World and Universal Orlando tickets, sometimes upwards of 12% off. And just so you know, Unlocked Magic is run by the exact same team behind the DVC rental store and the DVC resale market. So just pick your dates, grab your tickets, and go. Unlocked Magic makes it easy to rack up some pretty significant savings. Oh, and when you get your tickets, tell the nice folks at Unlocked Magic that it was Dan and it was Jim that sent you there. Okay, so let's get back to this board you're talking about, Dan. Speaking of people who are now dealing with boards, let's turn our attention to new Disney CEO Josh D'Amaro. Variety ran a giant profile this past week about Mr. D'Amaro, who's due to officially become Disney's new CEO on March 18th. And while he declined to be interviewed for this piece, it's what struck me about Josh wasn't necessarily what he promised, is what he didn't. So just to review here, there have been no big declarations about Marvel dominance. There have been no bold Star Wars is back proclamation, and it's D'Amaro is talking in very measured, controlled language. And are you getting the same impression, Dan? What stood out to you?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely this article, it felt restrained. I mean, it certainly gave a nice, a great insight into his character. But this article, I mean, they acknowledge Marvel's recent underperformance, and they acknowledge Star Wars hasn't had a theatrical film in years. But then they quietly say things like executives are pleased with what they've seen from Avengers Doomsday. And rival studio heads privately predict it'll be the biggest movie of 2026. But then almost immediately, there's this little line in there. It was the health of the MCU does not hinge on one individual title. And I don't know, it kind of feels a lot like they're just laying some pieces out here.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense when you consider the numbers. In fact, this supposedly factored heavily into why the board picked Mr. D'Amaro, who, remember, had been in charge of Disney's Parks division to run the company, because experiences, Disney experiences, the parks, the cruises, consumer products. I was startled by this number, Dan, that 71% of Disney's operating income comes from that division of the company. So, kind of ironic here that movies are culturally loud, whereas the parks are actually, more financially significant, than movies long term with the company. So again, this is why the parks guy became the CEO, and we now see the impact that has on the overall game board.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's safe to say D'Amaro doesn't see Marvel as just films. He's approaching this from rides and cruises and retail and licensing and gaming. And with that, I mean, you have to, that has to shift how you evaluate risk. But then also, instead of centralizing creative control like, Bob Chapek did, Disney also, with this, elevated Dana Walden. And that's like moving a queen into position rather than grabbing all the pieces for yourself.
I like that. That's a good observation for your part because it's subtle, but it's also important. Because face it, Chapek wanted to show that he was in control of the board, whereas DeMauro, he seems to more to trust, the key players, the creatives here to play their lanes. Though, this said, did you see the news coming out of London just this past week about those Doomsday reshoots? Is this sure thing suddenly so sure? Is that? Should we think of that as trouble, or am I misreading the board? Hey, but tell you what, before we talk about that, there's this.
Dripping in gold? That's cool. Dripping in Velveeta's supremely creamy golden cheesiness? That's respect. Elevate your drip with Velveeta's range of outrageously delicious dips and dishes. Shells, cheese, melty blocks, and heat and eat queso that go all in on indulgence. Flex on your fam with a creamy, cheesy masterpiece and go all in on what you love with Velveeta. Respect the drip and satisfy your cravings. Bring home the drip with Velveeta.
And we're back. Before we get started here, I did want to point out something that only a guy who had previously been in charge of, the parks division, the Disney experiences, which, as you mentioned earlier, cruise line. Did you see where, how each of the Disney cruise line ships has a quote unquote godmother, a celebrity that's attached to the ship? And I'm asking because did you see who was made the godmother of the Adventure, the big ship, coming out of Singapore?
I did not. Who?
Robert Downey Jr. So, Doctor Doom is the godmother of the next big Disney cruise ship. But all right. Anyway, back to what we were talking about in the first part of this week's show. So, all right, let's look back over the past year or so in the MCU. So, Thunderbolts, enjoyable film, but still underperformed a wee bit at the box office. Brave New World, which, by the way, I finally got to see when Nancy and I drove down to Connecticut to collect our 2 adopted cats. I love whoever did the production design for this film, because to put the Red Hulk in Washington, D.C. during cherry blossom season, that was genius. Wonderful match of a color palette there. But then at the same time, we have our Disney Plus fatigue, which do you think that may be factored into the news we got just this past week about Wonder Man, about the viewership numbers were not what Disney had been hoping for there? I mean, do you, I guess Variety had this story recently about how Marvel is definitely in a rut. And toward that end, we had news this past week by way of actor David Harbour, of reshoots happening on Avengers Doomsday. And the particulars are, these reshoots are happening in London. They're supposed to take place over 3 weeks, and they're being done to refine story, spectacle, and character moments. And anecdotally, Dan, if you take all of this, doesn't this kind of run counter to the narrative that Disney, has been trying to put out for the past few months, that Marvel is turned a corner, that the bad times are behind us and they've righted the ship. I mean, we don't need to be concerned, right?
Here's the thing with the reshoots. We know, and this has been said for as long as the MCU or Marvel has been making their own movies, is that reshoots are sort of baked into the process. Now, granted, I think it's just a fact of Hollywood anymore that these huge productions seem to not have what they consider a finished script when they start filming. It seems crazy, but it happens. Now, with the reshoots, I think on one hand, they're probably reacting to things. If they've got a rough cut, they're looking at it and going, yeah, this doesn't quite hit or resonate. Another thing, and I'm not being an apologist for it, I know that's always been part of their process, but the other thing that intrigues me, and I just want to throw this out there, is would these late reshoots also accommodate having more characters, say more chairs of actors that we did not see in the chair video, having more characters able to film some scenes without as many eyes on the production, on the studio surrounding the surrounding area, because we know a lot of people were camping out and watching and seeing who's coming in, who's coming out, with things being shot in broad daylight, like the new Spider-Man movie, and in Scotland, and so would this 3-week sprint also allow for, say, somebody, and this is just speculation, but somebody like Halle Berry to make an appearance? Throwing that out there.
Oh, I love that. Because again, Ms. Berry recently did an interview saying that, she, it was unfortunate that she wasn't asked back, that she would have come. And I love that. All right. No, I love that spin on that. We have to put a little more icing on the cake. Okay.
Exactly. Now, I will say this. I mean, when you think about, you talk about the bad times, I think it's safe to say at this point that there was a Bob Chapek-sized ditch that was dug pretty deep for Marvel, and I think it took a while for them to get their footing out of it. And I think those two movies that you mentioned before, Brave New World and Thunderbolts, shouldered a lot of the imbalance on that. And streaming viewership just doesn't carry the same public scoreboard pressure as the box office does. So when a Disney Plus series underperforms, it adjusts future budgets, but I don't necessarily believe it defines the brand. But here's my counter to that.
Okay.
So if Marvel moves an Avengers level piece, they do tend to win. So I'm talking about like an Infinity War or an Endgame or even No Way Home. Those weren't necessarily incremental victories. Those were pretty much checkmates. So I think the mistake that that seems to be happening, sort of in the public forums right now, is that comparing solo Phase 5 films to Phase 3's crescendo is kind of like expecting a checkmate with every move.
That is an excellent point. Face it, to build to an Infinity War and then an Endgame, when you think about the dozens of movies it took to get us to that point, and the payoff because of it. I mean, I still, wasn't it Age of Ultron, where we had that one little character moment where they're in the Stark Tower, and everybody's trying to pick up Thor's hammer, and And we see Thor, when Steve Rogers is with it, and it moves slightly, and he registers that. And what is it, 10, 12 movies later, that finally pays off. And it's worth it for that moment when, and Thor's like, I knew it. It's just sort of like, but, I mean, the notion from a storytelling point of view to set up that moment 10 movies earlier, and to listen to the audience, the noise that the audience made, when I knew it, just because they remembered it too. But, all right. So, maybe it's not, or, it's realistic to go individual films versus something like that, where, again, you build to a legitimate crescendo. So, all right. So what are we talking here? Has Marvel shifted from constant offense to now, what are we talking about? Positional play? I mean, fewer big swings, more setups, which I guess, again, brings us to Doomsday because, you were just talking at the top of the show about, the Doomsday Oreos, but there is something deliberate going on right now in regard to Doctor Doom. I mean, for example, Marvel Comics just announced Doom Day 1, and it's supposed to be a definitive origin story being released this June. So, and again, you work the calendar, 6 months before Avengers Doomsday. I'm sorry, Dan, that doesn't seem random to me.
No. I mean, that's definitely a watch this space book when that comes out. And I mean, this is where we're talking about that. This is like board preparation because they are codifying Doom, making sure that the casual audiences understand him before he arrives. The whole thing with Oreo. Yeah, there's 4 collectible packs. 3 of them are the regular ones with apparently you got to lick them. I didn't know that. But they've got the color changing cream and they've got the Marvel, an assortment of Marvel heroes on them, and they're widely available. But then the final pack, the hero pack, the one that's going to be short in the box, is the stuff of Doom. And yes, all 4 of these combine into this battle image. But just the idea that they are definitely, for anybody out there, I mean, there has to be this thought like, well, what about people who don't know Doctor Doom? They didn't do I'm going to have to say, certainly has much more awareness than Kang the Conqueror ever did, but they're not taking a risk. So which we're having is merchandising, we have narrative setting, and we're going to have a whole lot of cookies in my belly.
And now you had to tell me that the 4 different packages form a battle scene. I literally threw out my 1 of 4. Now I got to go buy it. Oh, God. All right. In keeping with our chess motif here, you don't place that many pieces on the board if you're actually unsure of your end game. I mean, think about it. We're talking about publishing. We're talking about licensing, grocery shelves. I mean, that's all really infrastructure, Dan. And more to the point, that's groundwork that has to be laid months in advance.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. But I think there's something that is starting to, I think, bubble up to the surface. And I want to talk about it, the elephant in the IMAX theater.
Okay.
And it's this.
Okay.
Doomsday is currently slated to open up against Dune Part 3. And Robert Downey Jr. has coined the term Doomsday. He was actually with Timothy Chalamet when he mentioned this. But this is the catch. Dune has IMAX exclusivity opening weekend. So no IMAX theaters for Doomsday. So, which means that Marvel either moves or sacrifices those premium screens, and that's a real trade-off. Because I mean, are they confident enough to hold the position, or do they shift? You think about this. It's not that it's less about which would succeed more, Doomsday or Dune. And I get that there's this idea of, we'll do Barbenheimer again, but the fact is, Oppenheimer was big screen, and Barbie worked on any size screen. Whereas to not have that IMAX, screen experience, that decision, this decision could tell you a lot about how we're viewing Doomsday. Are we going to see it? Are they going to move? I don't know.
I want to add one other little wrinkle to this story, but think about it. If we make the comparison of Infinity War and Endgame, Infinity War effectively set up Endgame. We all came back because we had to see how that story ended. And so even if this is the case, that Dune Part 3 eats up all the IMAX screens, if we jump ahead now to December of 2027, is that still going to be the case when Avengers Secret Wars arrive? And that's literally the payoff for Doomsday? Is that another consideration here on Marvel's part? It's like, okay, we lose out on IMAX revenue in 2026, but they come back they come back bigger and hungrier in 2027. Well, anyway, I give that some thought, but now to pivot back to those 3 weeks of Doomsday reshoots. So again, we don't need to be concerned about these, right?
Like I said, reshoots, they're baked in. They're baked in. They're part of Marvel's creative process. You edit the film, you see what's missing, story, character, motivation, and then they shoot to address that. One thing, like I mentioned, we might have this scenario, or we have some additional cast members part of these reshoots. I would like to think that, but I will say this: one of the great moments of the way after the movie is done, post-production fixes, not even a reshoot, as it was just grabbing Robert Downey Jr. as soon as possible, was him saying, "I'm Iron Man" at Avengers Endgame. In fact, the editor, or one of the editors, is the one who even coined that. So, these movies can be affected at the very, very last minute before release.
Understood. But if we now shift over to Sony Columbia and their Spider-Verse, are we as confident that the folks there, like the folks at Disney and Marvel Studios, know what they're doing, that they've learned from the mistakes of the past?
Well, I mean, we will say this. Recently, Tom Rothman, he did confirm a full-scale reboot of their live-action villain universe, and that means Morbius and Madam Web and Kraven. That experiment, that's done. And he said scarcity has value, which sounds like corporate shorthand for we flooded the board.
The irony here is as far back as 2013, they were talking about this idea, using the deep bench of Spider-Man supporting characters and supervillains to create this series of spin-off films and TV shows. And it gets off to a relatively promising start in 2018 with the first Venom film, but then Morbius in 2022, and then Madam Web and Kraven in 2024, and it all goes sideways for some reason. So what do you think happened there?
Oh, okay. Here, hold on. I just gotta reach behind here and grab my soapbox. Okay. So I personally have a long-standing beef with projects built around a character yet not featuring that character, and it's not always been to my advantage. But I will say, like when the producers of Smallville proclaimed "no cape, no tights," I responded, "No Dan." When Gotham was announced and there would be no Batman, I slid back into the shadows. And that entire time we've been getting these non-Spider-Man Spider-Man movies, I complained that it would ultimately be a waste of everyone's time. And I mean, The Guardian had an article that felt very similarly, and they did not mince words. They said, what's the point of a Spider-Man universe without Spider-Man. You know what's fascinating is that Sony kind of seems to be agreeing. Rothman's open to rebooting with this fresh narrative perspective. And even more so, and I don't know if you saw this, Jim, he was completely complimentary about Doomsday. I mean, we got to talk about the fact that this is a guy from a competing studio, and he's laid eyes on it in some capacity. That kind of transparency, that seems really new for two studios that are technically competitors, well, literally competitors. That level of openness suggests some alignment, or at least a mutual interest.
And speaking of alignment from Sony, Amy Pascal, producer of the Tom Holland Spider-Man movies, the Spider-Verse animated trilogy, and a litany of other productions, was honored with the David O. Selznick Award at the PGA Awards recently. And she had a great line in her acceptance speech where she said, being a producer is having the self-confidence, or at least pretending that you do, that when a Kevin says, I think I can help you, you let him. And that, to what you said earlier, that's a very public acknowledgement of the Feige partnership.
Yes, that is absolutely fascinating, especially because the first time Kevin Feige suggested this, she is on record for saying she threw a sandwich at him. But now, where we are now, that's not just polite thank you language. That's Pascal saying out loud that a collaboration with Marvel isn't a concession, it's a strength. And after everything in 2019, with that partnership almost collapsed, we hear her frame it in this way. It does feel intentional.
Well, especially at the Producers Guild. I mean, that room understands what a partnership actually means. And which, again, makes perfect sense when you look at the calendar. I mean, Spider-Man Brand New Day takes place in 2028, and that's 4 years after No Way Home. It's what, the furthest forward story in the MCU timeline? And it also happens before Doomsday. So that placement seemed deliberate to you, Dan?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think they're positioning Spider-Man as the emotional anchor before multiversal chaos. And meanwhile, Sony saturates the market, but in a totally different, slightly more dependable way by having the Raimi and the Garfield films hit HBO Max starting, today, March 1st.
And then there's Spider Noir with Nicolas Cage coming to Prime, and with black and white and color versions. Have you seen that?
Oh, I have. And here's something. I dressed up as Spider Noir a few years ago for Halloween. And no, most of the folks in my neighborhood had no idea who I was.
Okay.
Which is usually the case. But I'll be honest, this feels like the Matt Reeves Batman situation to me. And that's where we have a shared universe over here and an auteur sandbox over there. Different pieces, same board. Where in the case of the Batman Elseworld movies, I feel like DC probably told James Gunn, do whatever you want with DC, except for this over here, because it performed really well. Now, maybe Sony finally learned if it's hero-centered and bold, it lives. If it's villain-adjacent filler, it dies.
Okay. So, leaving the Spider-Verse behind, let's head to a little corner of the galaxy far, far away. But before we do that, there's this.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. Stop waiting around for the perfect candidate. Instead, use Indeed sponsored jobs to find the right people with the right skills fast. It's a simple way to make sure your listing is the first candidates see. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs have 4 times more applicants than non-sponsored jobs. So go build your dream team today with Indeed. Get a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
And we're back. Okay, let's have a quick Star Wars related chat. Internally, circling back to that Variety article we talked about at the top of today's show, there were reports that Mandalorian and Grogu's Super Bowl spot didn't spark the excitement that Disney had hoped for. Because again, and that's kind of notable because this is the first theatrical Star Wars release in nearly 8 years. And I want to say for you and I, Dan, it landed, but I guess we have an exceptional or a certain fondness for what is it? Clydesdale-like band tauntauns. There we go.
Yeah,
okay,
exactly.
But anyway, meanwhile, people who have actually seen footage from Star Wars Starfighter are praising Ryan Gosling's performance in this film. And by the way, just going to say, not necessarily going to hurt Star Wars Starfighter's chances at the box office, given that, have you seen the early reviews for Project Hail Mary? That, people are saying it's the best sci-fi film since Interstellar. And this being a Marvel podcast and all, I'm just going to acknowledge that the guys who are directing and producing Project Hail Mary are Phil Lord and Christopher Miller, the same guys behind the animated Spider-Verse trilogy. So, again, that can't hurt either. So, okay, back to the Star Wars movies now. So what are we thinking? What with Disney, after 8 years, easing back into the Star Wars theatrical film release game? Is Grogu the safe move, whereas Starfighter is the bold one?
Well, I probably under a Parks First CEO, Star Wars might be heading towards brand mythology again. Let's not forget. And next year, we're going to have the 50th anniversary of the original release of Star Wars. Not episode 4, hopefully, just Star Wars. So, I think we're seeing a little bit of, maybe less, this must dominate box office and more of this fuels experiences.
Okay, that's an interesting take. Okay, before we wrap and ask whether this is strategy or survival, let's zoom out and again, continuing with our chessboard conceit. Look at the game we're building here. So we have a new CEO. We have creative leadership at the studio has stabilized. Marvel is making an effort to temper expectations publicly. And executives are both at Disney and, as you mentioned earlier in the show, Sony are expressing confidence privately. And Doom is being installed. Well, we have our comic book coming in June, and we have cookies arriving in the mail as we speak, right, Dan? And back to Sony, we have a Sony that is now retreating to hero-first storytelling, with Spider-Man being positioned as a bridge. And then back to Star Wars for a moment, they're recalibrating. At this point, is anyone actually in check?
I'd say considering the executive level of where a lot of the news and articles was living or generating from this week, or from the last couple weeks, it feels like a lot of pieces moving deliberately. So maybe constant checkmates aren't the goal. And maybe this is about a sustained position over time. And if Doomsday lands, this week will look like quiet positioning before a decisive move. And if it doesn't, you know what? We can revisit this episode, and I'll just eat my Doom Oreos in shame.
Which, by the way, still on brand. Oh, okay. With that, folks, let's wrap this episode up. So, Dan, where else on the interwebs can the nice folks find you?
You know what? Check us out. Check me out on the Hububbery on YouTube, HUBBUBBERY. Just launched a new small format show called The Candy Dandy, which would be me, on the staying on track with the food thing, and I break down in a few minutes or less the history and a little more explanation behind circus peanuts, which, spoiler, I actually kind of like.
Wow.
So check that out.
Okay. All right. I'm going to insist the spotlight be shined on the Charleston chew, which is, I personally like and also use as caulking material.
Oh.
So, all right. And speaking of other shows, we have a few of them here at Jim Hill Media. We, of course, have Disney Dish with Len Testa, Fine Tuning with Drew Taylor, the Epic Universal podcast. I do that with Eric Hersey. He produces a lot of the shows here. And there is also I Want That Too, the Disney Merch podcast I do with Eric's lovely bride, Lauren. Also want to take a moment here to thank, again, Eric as well as David Gray for the great job they do when it comes to the editing and production of this podcast. Also, have a quick favor to ask of you folks. If you get head on over to Apple Podcasts and rate and review Marvelous Disney, that will help other folks find this podcast. And let's see, social media-wise, I'm on X and Instagram as Jim Hill Media, and then over on Facebook as Jim Hill Media News. And with that, I think that's going to do it for this week's edition of Marvelous Disney. So on behalf of Mr. Graney, I want to thank you for listening, and we will be back soon with more Marvel-related news.